The Fabian Experiment, elite governance behind electoral theatre. Picture a British voter in July 2024, casting their ballot to change the country. Labour defeats the Conservatives after 14 years. The rhetoric promises transformation, new direction, fresh leadership, an end to chaos. Yet by December, the same civil servants draft similar white papers. The same regulatory bodies continue decade-long processes. The same international commitments bind government action. The voter chose Labour's Keir Starmer over Conservative Rishi Sunak. But both had attended the same schools of thought. Both accepted the same bureaucratic frameworks. Both operated within the same institutional constraints. When Starmer's government published its immigration white paper in May 2025, it extended settlement periods and enhanced requirements through gradualist reform, expertly administered, technically justified. This is not conspiracy. It is method, a specific approach to governance developed 140 years ago by a small society meeting in Victorian London. They called it permeation. The Fabian Society, founded the 4th of January 1884, pioneered a form of social transformation that bypassed revolutionary politics entirely. Instead of storming the barricades, they infiltrated the institutions. Instead of popular uprising, they pursued expert influence. Instead of dramatic change, they practiced what Sidney Webb termed the inevitability of gradualness. Today, as voters experience the theatre of left-right competition, the underlying machinery of governance operates according to principles these Victorian reformers established through research-driven policy, administrative continuity, technocratic expertise, trumping popular will. The thesis we examine is whether modern democracy has become a Fabian system, constrained democracy, operating within frameworks established by expert networks and bureaucratic structures while maintaining electoral forms. Democracy remains on stage, administration runs the theatre. Now let's trace how this system developed, starting with its origins in Victorian London. The Fellowship of the New Life met through 1883 in Thomas Davidson's philosophical discussions about moral regeneration. By the 24th of October 1883, a faction led by Edward Pease grew impatient with spiritual introspection. They wanted practical politics. On the 4th of January 1884, the split became formal. Frank Podmore moved an amendment establishing the Fabian Society, explaining the name as an allusion to the victorious policy of Fabius Cunctator. The Roman general Fabius defeated Hannibal not through direct confrontation, but through delay, harassment, and strategic patience. The early Fabians adopted this as their explicit method. Their original motto declared that for the right moment you must wait, as Fabius did most patiently when warring against Hannibal, though many censured his delays, but when the time comes, you must strike hard, as Fabius did, or your waiting will be in vain and fruitless. But what did striking hard actually mean? Edward Pease's authoritative history of the Fabian Society, published in 1916, documents their answer through permeation. This was their term, not ours. Bernard Shaw defined it precisely in Fabian Tract 41. The Fabian Society brings all the pressure and persuasion in its power to bear on existing forces, caring nothing by what name any party calls itself, but having regard solely to the tendency of its actions, supporting those which make for socialism and democracy. Margaret Cole later described this as honeycombing, placing Fabian members in positions to either take direct action or directly influence others. Permeation is not a conspiracy, it's a career path. By 1908, Shaw could claim triumph, saying they permeated the party organizations and pulled all the wires they could lay their hands on with their utmost adroitness and energy, and they succeeded so far that in 1888 they gained the solid advantage of a progressive majority, full of ideas that would never have come into their heads had not the Fabian put them there. The Victorian context matters crucially. This was the era of what historians call the administrative impulse, the belief that social problems required systematic study and expert solution. The Fabians embraced positivism, positioning themselves as latter-day Benthamites, as Sidney Webb described them. They published Facts for Socialists, using statistical analysis to document social conditions. Their tract number 5, written by Y. Webb, became perhaps the most effective socialist tract ever published in England, according to Pease. This connected to broader intellectual currents through R. Auguste Comte's scientific sociology, John Stuart Mill's empiricism, Henry George's land economics. But the Fabians added something distinct, a systematic theory of institutional change through gradual infiltration rather than democratic mobilization or revolutionary action. Sidney Webb's vision proved central when he argued that all students of society realize that important organic changes can only be democratic and prepared for, in the minds of all, gradual, and thus causing no dislocation, constitutional and peaceful. This was the inevitability of gradualness. Change would come not through popular uprising, but through expert guidance of existing institutions. Shaw explicitly rejected romantic revolutionary liberalism and catastrophist methods. The Fabian knows that property does not hesitate to shoot, he wrote, and the Fabian does not intend to get thus handled if he can help it. To understand how Fabian methods relate to contemporary governance, we need to examine the political science concepts that illuminate these patterns. Permeation was their term for gradually influencing existing institutions rather than creating new ones or mobilizing mass movements. Modern political science offers additional concepts that help us understand what we're seeing today. Cartel party theory, developed by Richard Katz and Peter Mayer, describes how political parties increasingly function as state-supported cartels, using public resources to limit competition while politics becomes self-referential, professional, and technocratic. What looks like a choice between left and right often turns out to be a choice between adjacent settings on the same thermostat. A concrete example appears in British monetary policy, where Bank of England independence, established in 1997, created cross-party continuity in technocratic management, regardless of electoral outcomes. Colin Crouch's Post-Democracy identifies societies that continue to have and to use all the institutions of democracy, but in which they increasingly become a formal shell, while real power concentrates in small circles of a politico-economic elite. Elite circulation, theorized by Vilfredo Pareto and Gaetano Mosca, explains how societies are always ruled by small elites, with political change occurring through replacement of one ruling group by another rather than popular revolution. State capture describes how regulatory agencies come to serve the industries they regulate rather than public welfare, what George Stigler analyzed as regulators becoming comfortable with those they oversee. The Overton window, named for Joseph Overton, defines the range of policies considered acceptable by mainstream populations at any time. Politicians operate within this window rather than expanding it, while think tanks and expert networks work to shift its boundaries. Principal-agent problems arise when agents like politicians and bureaucrats pursue their own interests rather than those of their principals like voters and citizens, particularly under conditions of asymmetric information. Technocracy means governance by technical experts based on scientific knowledge rather than democratic processes. Policy feedbacks describe how policies reshape political landscapes and influence subsequent policy-making by creating constituencies, altering institutions, and changing public attitudes. Epistemic communities, networks of professionals with recognized expertise, influence policy by providing technical knowledge during periods of uncertainty. The Monnet method, named after European integration architect Jean Monnet, involves functional cooperation in specific technical areas, creating spillover effects toward deeper political integration. Permissive consensus describes the period when European publics remained passive about integration, allowing elite-driven processes to proceed without public opposition. These concepts illuminate patterns where democratic institutions persist, while real policy-making power concentrates in expert networks operating through bureaucratic structures, precisely the system Fabian methods aimed to create. Let's see how Sidney and Beatrice Webb transformed Fabian theory into practical institutions. The Webbs took the theoretical framework and made it concrete through systematic institution building. Their 1897 industrial democracy introduced the term to social sciences, while Beatrice coined collective bargaining in 1891, fundamentally reshaping how we understand labor relations. More importantly, they demonstrated the research to policy pathway that became the Fabian model. The London School of Economics was conceived on the 4th of August 1894 and opened in 1895 using £20,000 bequest from Henry Hunt Hutchinson received the previous year, exemplified this approach. 4 Fabians, Sidney Webb, Beatrice Webb, Graham Wallas, and George Bernard Shaw, used this inheritance to create an institution explicitly designed to train the expert administrators their vision required. The LSE wasn't just a university, it was a policy factory. The Webb's approach followed a clear sequence that would become their standard method. Research the problems systematically, draft practical solutions, place allies in positions to implement them. Sidney Webb's work on London County Council from 1892 to 1910 showed this method in action. He created the system of secondary state schools and the scholarship system for elementary school pupils, providing blueprints for the Education Acts of 1902 and 1903. Municipal socialism, what critics called gas and water socialism, demonstrated Fabian methods at local level. The LCC, established in 1889, pursued municipal ownership of utilities. Webb praised Birmingham's municipal water system, built all without the intervention of a contractor. To Webb, an aqueduct from the Welsh hills would make the waterlords see their polluted supply obsolete. The policy drafting process was systematic and methodical. Webb's statistical work in Facts for Socialists and Facts for Londoners provided research foundation. This fed into specific policy proposals published as Fabian tracts. These influenced party platforms as Webb wrote Labour's 1918 Constitution and Labour and the New Social Order. Finally, Fabian members in government and civil service implemented the policies. The New Statesman, founded on the 12th of April 1913 by the Webbs with Shaw's financial support, extended this influence into journalism and intellectual discourse. Webb's stated purpose was to permeate the educated and influential classes with progressive ideas. David Alfred Thomas, a Liberal Member of Parliament, observed that the New Statesman was being taken in by an enormous number of civil servants. It was penetrating right through Whitehall. This created a feedback loop where research institutions produced expert knowledge, publications disseminated ideas to elites, political parties incorporated proposals into platforms, civil servants implemented policies, and think tanks evaluated results to refine the process. The gains were substantial through systematic data collection, improving policy quality, professional administration, replacing patronage systems, long-term planning addressing complex social problems. The NHS, state education and municipal services, reflected Fabian research and advocacy spanning decades. But pathologies emerged too. Bureaucratic distance grew between experts and citizens. Information bottlenecks concentrated power among those who understood complex systems. Democratic frictions increased as technical complexity made policies harder for voters to evaluate or control. George Bernard Shaw understood what Sidney Webb did not, that lasting political change requires cultural preparation. Shaw's theatrical career was explicitly political. His plays presented rational, scientifically minded characters solving social problems through expert knowledge rather than democratic participation. In Major Barbara, the munitions manufacturer Undershaft out-argues both the Salvation Army idealist and the classical scholar, demonstrating that systematic analysis trumps both religious sentiment and traditional education. The prefaces to Shaw's plays functioned as extended political essays reaching audiences who would never read Fabian tracts. His 1908 preface to Fabian essays rejected romantic revolutionary liberalism while explaining that the Fabian does not intend to get thus handled if he can help it. Shaw made gradual expert-led reform appear reasonable, inevitable, and morally superior to both reactionary preservation and revolutionary disruption. Contemporary reviews document Shaw's cultural impact. Critics recognized his systematic effort to reshape public attitudes toward governance and expertise. Max Beerbohm noted Shaw's ability to make audiences think they are thinking while actually accepting predetermined conclusions about social organization. Shaw's lecture program was equally systematic. The Fabian Society documented 700 lectures delivered by members of the Fabian Society alone in the year ending the month of April 1889. Shaw himself delivered hundreds, refining arguments through direct engagement with working-class audiences. This wasn't just publicity, it was cultural reconnaissance, testing which arguments resonated and which needed refinement. The intellectual groundwork preceded policy implementation by decades. Shaw's plays in the 1990s normalized ideas about expert administration that became government policy in the 1940s. Cultural hegemony, the process by which dominant ideas become common sense, operated through entertainment, criticism, and popular education rather than political argument. This model influenced later cultural progressives through the assumption that artistic and intellectual elites should guide social change, that expert knowledge deserves deference from ordinary citizens, that complex problems require technocratic solutions. These ideas became embedded in cultural institutions long before they dominated governmental ones. Now let's examine how the managerial mindset Fabians developed domestically extended to empire and later to development economics. The Fabian Colonial Bureau, established in October 1940, strongly influenced the colonial policies of the Attlee government from 1945 to 1951, according to historical records. Rita Hindon founded and led the Colonial Bureau, producing continuous analysis of imperial administration and self-government. The Bureau's reports reflected classic Fabian methodology through systematic research, gradual reform, expert guidance of political development. They didn't question whether Britain should manage colonial development. They focused on how to do it more efficiently and humanely. Individual colonial leaders absorbed these ideas directly. Jawaharlal Nehru was significantly influenced by Fabian socialist thinking during his time in Britain, subsequently framing economic policy for India using state-controlled heavy industry and central planning mechanisms that reflected Fabian approaches. Muhammad Ali Jinnah had exposure to Fabian ideas through political circles in London during his legal and political education. The institutional arrangements these leaders established after independence reflected Fabian technocratic approaches to modernization. But the imperial dimension revealed Fabian limitations most clearly. The assumption that expert elites could guide social development imposed metropolitan models on diverse societies with different traditions, needs, and preferences. Colonial administrators, however well-intentioned, lacked the local knowledge and democratic accountability needed for effective governance. Contemporary voices recognized these problems. Colonial subjects criticized paternalistic administration even when it was competent and well-meaning. The tension between efficiency and consent, between expert knowledge and local autonomy, between gradual reform and political self-determination, created ongoing conflicts that technical solutions couldn't resolve. Development economics inherited these assumptions. World Bank and IMF approaches to modernization followed Fabian patterns through expert analysis, technical recommendations, gradual implementation through administrative mechanisms. The Washington Consensus and subsequent good governance frameworks reflected systematic efforts to transfer institutional models from advanced to developing countries. Critics like Thomas Sowell identified this as governance by intellectuals and experts that undermined both democratic accountability and local adaptation. The persistent difficulties of development assistance partly reflect tensions inherent in technocratic approaches to social change that the Fabians pioneered but never resolved. The Labour Party provided the primary vehicle for Fabian influence on British policy, and the connections run deep. The institutional pathway was direct, since the Fabian Society was one of the founding organisations of the Labour Representation Committee in 1900 and remains the only original founder that remains affiliated in unchanged form. The key was personnel. Michael Young, serving as Labour Party head of research, authored the historic 1945 manifesto, Let Us Face the Future. Sidney Webb wrote Labour's 1918 Constitution and Labour and the New Social Order. Beatrice Webb's 1909 Minority Report on Poor Laws provided the intellectual foundation for the welfare state, as William Beveridge acknowledged that the Beveridge Report stemmed from what all of us had imbibed from the Webbs. The 1945 implementation revealed Fabian methods at scale. 229 Fabian members sat in the House of Commons after the election. The NHS, nationalisation programmes, and comprehensive education all reflected decades of Fabian research and advocacy. But this wasn't conspiracy, it was the fruition of systematic intellectual work conducted openly through democratic institutions. Case studies show clear causation chains. The 1911 Fabian Tract proposing a national medical service led to the 1945 Manifesto Commitment implemented as the NHS in 1948, a 37-year development cycle. R.H. Tawney's 1922 pamphlet, Secondary Education for All, influenced Labour education policy through the 1960s when Tony Crosland used Circular 10/65 to implement comprehensive schooling without requiring legislation. Another clear example appears in Ed Ball's 1992 Fabian pamphlet, Euro-Monetarism, Why Britain Was Right to Say No, which included arguments for Bank of England independence that became the most significant Fabian contribution to Labour's policy agenda when implemented by Gordon Brown in 1997. This demonstrates the classic research-to-policy pathway spanning 5 years from publication to implementation. The policy feedback effects were substantial. NHS implementation created constituencies supporting state healthcare provision. Nationalisation programs established bureaucratic expertise in managing major industries. Comprehensive education systems trained administrators comfortable with large-scale social engineering. But correlation doesn't always equal causation. The NHS became rapidly embedded in British identity beyond technocratic planning, suggesting popular demand exceeded Fabian expectations. Aneurin-Bevan's resignation over health charges showed democratic pressures could override expert recommendations. The 2017 election demonstrated expert predictions could fail as the Fabian General Secretary expected Labour to win fewer than 150 seats, but the party won 262. These cases show elite influence is strong, but not absolute. Counter-examples exist throughout the record. Conservative governments after 1895 were equally resistant to LCEC water nationalisation plans. NHS implementation faced opposition from all quarters, doctors who did not want to become instruments of the state. The Fabian Society Tax Commission's 2000 recommendation for a new top rate of income tax was to the left of government policy and not accepted until 2010. The Labour synthesis shows both Fabian influence and its limits. Clear institutional pathways exist from research to policy implementation. But democratic constraints, electoral pressures, and practical difficulties modified or defeated many Fabian proposals. The pattern suggests influence rather than control, significant but not determining. Fabian methods spread internationally through multiple channels with varying degrees of direct influence versus parallel development. The American Fabian Society, established in Boston in 1895 by W.D.P. Bliss, provided direct institutional transfer to the United States. The Society published the American Fabian periodical and pamphlets, though its influence remained limited compared to indigenous progressive-era reforms. FDR's brain trust of academic advisors, Raymond Moley, Rexford Tugwell, Adolph Burley from Columbia, resembled Fabian methodology, but appears to represent parallel evolution rather than direct borrowing. Scandinavian social democracy shows similar patterns. Sweden's middle way between capitalism and socialism emerged from different historical conditions, including homogeneous society, strong peasant representation, distinctly Nordic corporatist traditions. While Swedish Social Democrats had exposure to international socialist thinking, primary architects Ernst Wigforss and Per Albin Hansson drew more heavily from Keynesian economics than Fabian gradualism. The Commonwealth dimension reveals clearest transmission. The Fabian Colonial Bureau directly influenced decolonization policies. Individual leaders like Nehru absorbed Fabian ideas during their political education in Britain, then implemented state-controlled development models after independence. Post-colonial institutional arrangements reflected Fabian technocratic approaches to modernization, often with mixed results due to insufficient attention to local conditions and democratic participation. International organizations adopted similar methods without necessarily direct Fabian influence. World Bank and IMF approaches emphasize technical expertise, gradual implementation, and policy standardization across countries. The World Bank's self-description as a knowledge bank mirrors Fabian research methodology. IMF conditionalities reflect systematic policy transfer mechanisms resembling Fabian permeation strategies. Climate governance represents a contemporary example. Expert panels, like the IPCC, provide technical recommendations implemented through international agreements and domestic regulations. The process bypasses democratic debate about fundamental policy directions, focusing instead on technical implementation of expert consensus, classic Fabian methodology applied to global challenges. Now, let's examine what may be the most sophisticated contemporary example of Fabian-style governance. The European Union represents perhaps the most sophisticated contemporary example of Fabian-style governance through gradual, expert-led integration, creating irreversible institutional changes while maintaining democratic forms. Jean Monnet's method closely paralleled Fabian approaches. Begin with limited economic cooperation in specific sectors like coal and steel. Pool sovereignty gradually through functional pressures. Create supranational institutions staffed by technical experts. Let functional spillovers drive further integration toward political union without requiring explicit democratic mandates. The European Commission's legislative monopoly exemplifies technocratic governance. Commission officials, drawn from member state bureaucracies and academic institutions, draft legislation based on expert analysis rather than electoral programs. The comitology system, committees of national civil servants implementing European Union law, operationalizes technocracy by operating largely outside democratic oversight. Council and Parliament provide democratic legitimacy, but within frameworks established by technocratic processes. Permissive consensus enabled this system for decades. European publics remained passive about integration details, allowing elite-driven processes to proceed without sustained opposition. Integration advanced through administrative decisions, court rulings, and regulatory harmonization rather than popular mobilization or electoral competition. The parallels to Fabian methods are striking. Both approaches emphasize functional cooperation, gradual change, expert administration, and elite consensus building. Both avoid popular mobilization in favor of institutional transformation. But crucial differences exist. European integration required explicit treaty negotiations and parliamentary ratifications that Fabian domestic permeation could avoid. Multi-level governance created more complex accountability relationships. National democratic traditions provided stronger constraints than British parliamentary sovereignty. The Brexit referendum demonstrated limits of technocratic integration. Popular override of elite consensus on European membership revealed democratic pressures that gradual, expert-led change could not ultimately contain. The constraining dissensus that replaced permissive consensus since the 1990s shows how democratic mobilization can disrupt technocratic governance even when institutional frameworks seem stable. Contemporary EU legitimacy debates echo historical critiques of Fabian methods. Questions about democratic accountability, elite responsiveness, and popular sovereignty that Victorian critics raised about municipal socialism now apply to supranational governance. The European project's future depends partly on resolving tensions between technocratic effectiveness and democratic participation that Fabian theorists never adequately addressed. Modern governance exhibits patterns remarkably similar to Fabian methods, adapted to contemporary conditions through platform technology, regulatory frameworks, and global policy networks. Platform governance represents a private sector update of administrative management. Companies like Google and Facebook shape human behavior through algorithmic choice architecture, nudging users toward preferred options without eliminating formal choice. This resembles Fabian approaches to social reform by guiding outcomes through institutional design, rather than coercive mandate or democratic mobilization. Regulatory frameworks operate through similar mechanisms. Standard-setting bodies, like the International Organization for Standardization, create rules governing everything from food safety to financial reporting. These technical standards shape economic behavior globally while remaining invisible to most citizens. Compliance becomes necessary for market access, creating functional mandates without democratic approval. Revolving door expertise demonstrates institutional permeation in contemporary form. If you want to know who governs, do not follow the speeches, follow the drafts. Former government officials join think tanks, consulting firms, and industry associations, maintaining policy influence through professional networks rather than electoral politics. The movement between regulatory agencies, lobbying firms, and academic institutions creates epistemic communities that shape policy discourse across partisan boundaries. Recent examples abound. Ed Ball's 1992 Fabian pamphlet on Bank of England independence became the most significant Fabian contribution to Labour's policy agenda when implemented by Gordon Brown in 1997. The policy removed monetary policy from democratic control, placing it with technical experts, using complex economic models most citizens cannot evaluate. Climate policy exemplifies contemporary technocratic governance. Expert panels provide scientific assessments. International bodies negotiate frameworks. Domestic regulations implement requirements through administrative mechanisms. Citizens experience the results through carbon taxes, building standards, transportation policies, but have limited ability to influence the technical analyses driving these decisions. Financial regulation after 2008 followed similar patterns. The Basel III framework, developed by central bank governors and implemented through domestic regulatory agencies, restructured global banking without requiring legislative approval in most countries. Technical complexity made democratic oversight difficult, even when formal parliamentary procedures were followed. White papers and regulatory consultations provide democratic legitimacy while limiting substantive input. Citizens can comment on policy proposals, but the technical complexity and predetermined frameworks constrain meaningful participation to expert networks already familiar with the issues. This creates an illusion of consultation while preserving technocratic control. The follow-the-science rhetoric during COVID-19 demonstrated both strengths and weaknesses of technocratic governance. Expert analysis enabled rapid policy responses to novel challenges. But scientific uncertainty, policy trade-offs, and value judgments required democratic input that technical expertise alone could not provide. The contemporary Labour government provides a natural experiment in Fabian influence on policy implementation. So let's examine some key figures with documented Fabian society connections who have been directly involved in major migration policy decisions. First, we have Keir Starmer, Member of Parliament, now Prime Minister. His Fabian connection includes service on the Executive Committee and authorship of The Road Ahead in 2021, marking the first time a serving member of the Fabian Society Executive had become leader of the party. As Prime Minister from July 2024, he oversaw publication of the Immigration White Paper on the 12th of May 2025, proposing to move the standard indefinite leave to remain qualifying period to 10 years with an earned settlement route for some categories. The document trail includes official Fabian Society records of his executive membership and authorship, plus the government.uk policy page for the Immigration White Paper with consultation pending and impacts uncertain. Next is Yvette Cooper, MP, serving as Home Secretary. Her current membership includes extensive Fabian Society engagement documented through events and policy development. Cooper announced the scrapping of the Rwanda policy on the 22nd of July 2024, calling it a £700 million grotesque waste of money. She ended retrospective elements of the Illegal Migration Act 2023 through Amendment Regulations 2024 and announced the decision to let the Bibi Stockholm asylum barge contract lapse on the 23rd of July 2024. The barge ceased operations in January 2025 and was towed away late that month. Her document trail includes parliamentary statement on the 22nd of July 2024 on Rwanda policy costs, the 2024 Amendment Regulations to the Illegal Migration Act, and Government United Kingdom announcements regarding accommodation policy changes. We also find Lord Alf Dubs in the House of Lords, listed as a current Vice President on the Fabian Society link after serving as former chair from 1994 to 1995. Dubs has been active in advocacy for refugee family reunion provisions and child refugee protection during passage of migration legislation from 2018 to 2025. The documentation includes Hansard records of House of Lords debates and official Fabian Society listings. Sadiq Khan serves as Mayor of London, listed as a current Vice President on the Fabian Society link after serving as former chair from 2008 to 2010. Khan implemented London-specific accommodation and integration policies for asylum seekers during crisis periods, particularly during hotel accommodation controversies. His record appears in Mayor of London official statements and verified Fabian Society leadership records. Sir David Bean, Lord Justice of Appeal, served as former Fabian Society chair from 1989 to 1990, as documented in official Fabian Society history. Bean delivered the Court of Appeal ruling in the Epping Bell Hotel case in August to September 2025, where the Court of Appeal, comprising Bean L.J., Nicola Davies L.J. and Cobb L.J. overturned the interim injunction against Home Office accommodation decisions. The court lifted an interim injunction rather than creating additional rights. The documentation includes official court judgment available through the Courts and Tribunals Judiciary website and Fabian Society historical records. The migration policy flashpoints during this period reveal the intersection of legal, administrative, and political pressures operating within established institutional frameworks. The Conservative government's Illegal Migration Act, receiving royal assent on the 20th of July 2023, created a duty to remove asylum seekers arriving irregularly with retrospective application from March 2023. However, Home Office operational difficulties prevented key provisions from being implemented. Upon taking office, the Labour government under Cooper ended the retrospective elements through statutory instruments 2024/1106 and 2024/1107, the Illegal Migration Act 2023, Commencement Num. 4, and Transitional Provisions Regulations and Asylum Accommodation Regulations, demonstrating how administrative capacity constraints can limit legislative effectiveness regardless of political will. The Rwanda Partnership, announced in April 2022, cost approximately £700 million, according to Cooper's statement on the 22nd of July 2024, with the previous Conservative government planning up to £10 billion more, despite removing zero asylum seekers to Rwanda. The Supreme Court's unanimous ruling on the 15th of November 2023 found the policy unlawful due to the real risk of refoulement, return to persecution. The European Court of Human Rights had earlier granted Rule 39 interim measures on the 14th of June 2022, blocking the first flight and allowing full judicial scrutiny. The policy's trajectory from announcement to abandonment illustrates how legal constraints and judicial review can override executive preferences even in areas of claimed democratic mandate. The Bibi Stockholm barge operated from August 2023 until January 2025 at approximately £6,000 per person per month due to under-occupancy. Issues included Legionella outbreak in August 2023, the December 2023 death of an Albanian asylum seeker, and continuous legal challenges. The Labour government announced on the 23rd of July 2024 that it would let the contract lapse, with the facility ceasing operations in January 2025 and being towed away on the 30th of January 2025. This demonstrates how operational difficulties and cost inefficiencies can make politically symbolic policies unsustainable in practice. The legal context here becomes important to understand. The European Convention on Human Rights creates binding obligations for everyone within jurisdiction, while Refugee Convention Article 33 establishes non-refoulement or non-return principles with limited exceptions under Article 33, subsection 2 for national security threats. UK courts balance statutory law with treaty obligations through proportionality assessments and legitimate expectation doctrines. The Supreme Court's Rwanda decision showed courts' willingness to scrutinize executive decisions on human rights grounds while respecting parliamentary sovereignty, finding domestic and international law aligned in preventing removals to countries with substantial refoulement risks. Published the 12th of May 2025, the Immigration White Paper proposes moving the standard indefinite leave to remain qualifying period to 10 years via an earned settlement model, enhanced English language requirements, and reformed graduate visa systems. The technical annex details the implementation framework, though consultation remains pending and impacts remain uncertain. This represents classic Fabian methodology through research-based policy development, gradual implementation, technical complexity, limiting democratic scrutiny to expert networks familiar with immigration law and economics. These findings document patterns of association and involvement without implying direct causation between Fabian Society membership and specific policy positions. Policy decisions result from multiple factors, including electoral mandates, civil service advice, legal constraints, judicial decisions, operational realities, and parliamentary processes. The documentation invites analysis of the role of intellectual networks and think tanks in British policy-making, while recognizing the complex, multifactorial nature of policy development in democratic systems operating within constitutional and legal frameworks. The question becomes, what democratic levers exist here? Parliament retains oversight through questioning and debate. Courts provide judicial review of executive decisions. Freedom of information requests can reveal decision-making processes. Public consultations, though technically complex, offer formal participation opportunities. Electoral competition remains the ultimate constraint on governmental direction. The strongest objections to the constrained democracy thesis deserve careful consideration, and they fall into several important categories. First, voters do change policy in fundamental ways. Brexit provides the clearest counterexample. The 2016 referendum overrode elite consensus across academic, business, media, and political establishments. Expert predictions of economic damage, warnings from international allies, and recommendations from technocratic institutions were rejected by 52% of voters. The subsequent political upheaval involving 3 prime ministers, multiple general elections, parliamentary deadlock, demonstrated that popular will could disrupt even deeply embedded institutional arrangements. The 2008 financial crisis response also shows democratic constraints on technocratic governance. Initial expert consensus supported bank bailouts using technical arguments about systemic risk and economic stability. But popular anger at bonus payments, taxpayer costs, and continued inequality forced policy modifications. The rise of populist movements across Europe and America partly reflects democratic backlash against technocratic approaches that failed to prevent the crisis while protecting those who caused it. Electoral competition still produces policy changes. The 1979 Conservative victory brought privatization, deregulation, and monetarism, reversing decades of Fabian-influenced social democratic consensus. The 1997 Labour victory restored trade union recognition, introduced minimum wages, and expanded public investment. The 2010 Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition implemented austerity policies Labour had rejected. These changes suggest electoral politics retains substantive impact on governance direction. Institutional checks remain effective in many areas. Parliamentary sovereignty, judicial review, media scrutiny, and civil society organizations provide ongoing constraints on administrative power. The Supreme Court's Rwanda decision demonstrated judicial willingness to constrain executive action. Parliamentary committees regularly challenge government policies and expose administrative failures. Media investigations reveal policy problems and force governmental responses. Professional civil service traditions, while influenced by Fabian approaches, also include norms of political neutrality and democratic accountability. Civil servants serve successive governments with different priorities. Permanent secretaries face parliamentary questioning. Freedom of information laws provide public access to governmental decision-making processes. International legal obligations create external constraints on domestic policy autonomy. European Convention on Human Rights requirements, Refugee Convention commitments, and trade agreement provisions limit governmental discretion regardless of electoral outcomes or administrative preferences. Contemporary governance challenges require technical knowledge that democratic processes alone cannot provide. Climate change involves scientific complexities most citizens cannot master. Financial regulation requires understanding of market mechanisms, systemic risks, and international coordination. Healthcare policy demands knowledge of medical research, cost-effectiveness analysis, and epidemiological modeling. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated both benefits and limits of expert guidance. Scientific analysis enabled rapid vaccine development and deployment. But lockdown policies involved value trade-offs, including economic costs, educational disruption, mental health impacts that required political rather than purely technical judgment. The most effective governmental responses combined expert analysis with democratic accountability and transparent communication. Technical complexity doesn't necessarily undermine democracy. It may require more sophisticated democratic institutions. Citizen juries, deliberative polling, participatory budgeting, and other innovations enable informed public input on complex issues. Professional administrators can serve democratic purposes when properly constrained and directed. The Fabian influence thesis may suffer from confirmation bias, finding patterns that confirm pre-existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. Policy continuities across electoral cycles might reflect institutional learning, successful approaches being retained regardless of partisan origins, rather than elite manipulation. Some capture claims appear overfitted to particular time periods or policy areas. Financial regulatory capture was evident before 2008, but post-crisis reforms strengthened oversight mechanisms. Environmental regulation faces industry influence, but also strong advocacy from environmental groups and public health constituencies. The international transmission analysis shows parallel evolution rather than direct Fabian influence in many cases. Similar governance challenges may produce similar institutional responses without requiring coordinated elite planning or deliberate policy transfer. These objections suggest a more nuanced picture than simple elite domination. Democratic institutions retain capacity to constrain administrative power, override expert consensus, and force policy changes through electoral competition. Civil society organizations, media scrutiny, judicial review, and international legal obligations provide ongoing checks on governmental autonomy. But the objections don't eliminate the core thesis entirely. Brexit succeeded only after sustained political mobilization, multiple electoral cycles, and enormous disruption to established institutional arrangements. Most policy areas lack the sustained public attention and political mobilization necessary to override expert consensus. The complexity of contemporary governance creates systematic advantages for those with technical knowledge, institutional position, and long-term strategic perspective. The pattern suggests constrained democracy rather than false democracy. Electoral competition and popular participation operate within frameworks established by administrative and expert elites, but these frameworks aren't impermeable to democratic pressure when sufficiently mobilized and sustained. After examining 140 years of institutional development, policy implementation, and democratic interaction, what can we conclude about the Fabian democracy thesis with confidence based on documented evidence? The record clearly demonstrates systematic influence by expert networks on policy development and implementation across multiple governmental cycles. The institutional pathways are well documented from Fabian society research and LSE academic work through think tank publications and civil service careers to policy drafting and legislative implementation. Specific causation chains can be traced across decades. The 1911 Fabian Tract on National Medical Service influenced the 1945 Labour Manifesto and led to NHS implementation in 1948. Beatrice Webb's 1909 Minority Report on Poor Laws provided intellectual foundations for the Beveridge Report and welfare state expansion. Ed Ball's 1992 Fabian pamphlet on central bank independence became policy in 1997. Keir Starmer's 2021 Fabian pamphlet, The Road Ahead, influenced 2024 Labour Manifesto commitments on constitutional reform and economic policy. Personnel connections are extensive and documented. 229 Fabian members sat in Parliament after the 1945 election. Around 200 Fabians sat in the House of Commons after 1997, including many of the Cabinet. More than half of Keir Starmer's 2024 Cabinet are current or former Fabian Society members. These aren't coincidences, they represent systematic networking and institutional influence over generations. Administrative expansion, European integration, and technocratic approaches to complex policy problems show remarkable continuity regardless of electoral outcomes. Brexit represents an exception that proves the rule, since it required sustained political mobilization, multiple referendums and elections, and enormous institutional disruption to override established policy directions. Civil service career patterns, regulatory framework development, and international commitment implementation proceed according to logic, largely independent of electoral competition. The Immigration White Paper 2025 approach through technical complexity, gradual implementation, expert analysis reflects methods established in Victorian municipal administration and applied across policy domains for over a century. Electoral competition continues, parliamentary procedures operate, judicial review functions, and media scrutiny persists. But the substance of policy development increasingly occurs within frameworks established by expert networks operating through bureaucratic institutions rather than popular mobilization or electoral mandate. The Overton window concept proves especially relevant. Political competition occurs within boundaries established by expert consensus about acceptable policy options. Politicians detect where the window is and position themselves accordingly rather than fundamentally challenging its limits. Think tanks and policy networks work to shift these boundaries through research, publication, and networking rather than electoral politics. The record also shows clear limitations and failures of technocratic approaches. The 2008 financial crisis reflected regulatory capture and expert overconfidence. Brexit demonstrated popular capacity to override elite consensus, despite enormous costs. COVID-19 responses revealed tensions between expert analysis and democratic accountability that technical solutions alone couldn't resolve. Policy predictions often fail. Economic modeling proves unreliable. Social interventions produce unintended consequences. International coordination creates democratic accountability problems. These failures suggest inherent limitations in technocratic governance rather than merely implementation problems. This research suggests practical questions citizens can ask to evaluate democratic versus technocratic governance in specific contexts. Follow the draft by asking who actually writes policy proposals. Are they elected officials, civil servants, think tank researchers, industry representatives, or academic experts? What institutional pathways do proposals follow from initial research to final implementation? Track the personnel by examining who staffs regulatory agencies, policy development units, and governmental advisory bodies. What are their career backgrounds, educational experiences, and professional networks? Do they rotate between government, academia, think tanks, and industry positions? Examine the consultation process by understanding when public input is sought, what forms it takes. Are alternatives genuinely considered, or does consultation focus on implementation details within predetermined frameworks? How is technical complexity used to limit meaningful participation? Assess democratic override capacity by determining whether electoral outcomes can substantially change policy directions, or do they mainly affect implementation details and rhetorical emphasis? What level of political mobilization is required to challenge expert consensus on major issues? Evaluate accountability mechanisms by asking whether decision-makers are subject to meaningful public scrutiny, electoral consequence, and institutional constraint. Can citizens effectively challenge policies through formal channels, judicial review, or political competition? The Fabian Society achieved much of what it set out to accomplish in 1884. Social reform through gradual institutional change, expert-guided policy development, and professional administration became the normal operating mode of British governance and influenced democratic systems globally. The welfare state, public healthcare, professional civil service, and technocratic approach to complex social problems reflect Fabian methods successfully implemented over generations. But the achievement created its own problems. Democratic accountability became harder to maintain as policy complexity increased. Elite networks gained systematic advantages over popular participation. Expert analysis acquired presumptive authority that limited genuine political choice. The gradual accumulation of administrative power created systemic constraints on democratic sovereignty that proved difficult to reverse through normal electoral processes. The thesis that modern democracy operates as constrained democracy behind electoral theater captures important aspects of contemporary reality. Technical complexity demands expertise, but expertise creates systematic advantages for elite networks over democratic participation. Gradual reform avoids disruptive change, but accumulates into transformations that were never explicitly democratically authorized. Professional administration improves policy quality, but reduces democratic accountability and popular control. The Fabian experiment continues. adapted to contemporary conditions through platform governance, international institutions, and global policy networks. Whether democratic institutions can evolve to manage this tension effectively, or whether elite-managed governance will continue expanding at democracy's expense remains the fundamental question of our political future. Permeation is the original Fabian society term for influencing existing institutions rather than creating new ones or mobilizing popular movements. Earlier academic discussions sometimes used permutation, but primary sources confirm permeation as the accurate historical term. Bernard Shaw wrote in Fabian Tract 41 from 1892 that the Fabian society brings all the pressure and persuasion in its power to bear on existing forces.